One of the things I'm often amazed with when I read Scripture, read some of the stories in Scripture, I am sometimes taken aback about how those stories can tell a brutal, challenging truth about our world. And our story this morning is one such of those stories. It's almost like in these stories from the Scripture, we catch a glimpse of a reality, particularly a reality of the world in which Jesus lived. In the story, many of you, I'm curious, how many of y'all have heard the story of Herod and John the Baptist? Well, more than I expected. It's not a story we read a lot. It's not a story that we've probably talked about a lot, in many ways because it's such a cruel and brutal story. And we're told that King Herod, he hears these rumors of Jesus, and it worries him. And so he talks to his advisors, and they talk about who could this Jesus be that he's doing these acts of compassion and exorcism. And it's interesting that it worries them that there's this Jesus out there doing these things like healing and speaking of God's love and grace. So we ask who it is, and some say maybe it's John the Baptist who's come back to life. And what's interesting, if you were reading through the Gospel of Mark, is you don't know what's happened to John the Baptist at this point. You don't even know that he has died. Or it could be Elijah. It could be a prophet from old. They're wrestling with this question of who is Jesus. And in fact, in the Gospel of Mark, one of the central themes throughout the Gospel is this question, who is this Jesus? And it's asked by Herod, it's asked by the Romans, it's asked by the disciples. And so that question is at the heart of the text this morning. It's the context for what they are wrestling with, the context in which we find out in a story what happened to John the Baptizer. And the first thing we find out is that Herod threw a party, had a birthday party, and he threw it for himself. It's often common in the world today, kings have a narcissism and egotism in which they throw a party for themselves. And for those who read this story, who heard this story, they would recognize it for what it was. In fact, you may be surprised that there are hundreds of paintings of what's called Herod's feast, of this birthday party he has. And it might be surprising, why would so many artists render these paintings of Herod's feast? It's because they recognized their world in what happened. That you have the king, the elite, the leaders, and the powerful who have big banquets and celebrations, opulence, and much food. In fact, all the paintings, if you saw through history, always shows, whether it was in the clothes of that time or the clothes of their particular time, this sense of opulence, and a sense of food pouring out, a sense of a huge banquet. And what's interesting about this story is that those who saw it and heard it and thought about it and had this image, it was always countered in many of the paintings by images of people who were poor and suffering. If they had TV back then, they'd have had lifestyles of the rich and famous, would be King Herod, right? Red carpet, bounty, right next to the reality of people going hungry. It's a rather brutal image if one really takes it in. This sense in which the rich and famous and the powerful are able to have this bounty while people are starving in the streets. That's what the listeners of this gospel would know in their heads, would imagine, because they experienced it. They would know and understand a story about a king who on a whim decides to behead someone he actually likes. Not simply on a whim, but because he promised he would do it, right? It was his own honor that he kills another human being. And in many ways, the listeners of those Gospels, those who lived in the first century, would recognize this reality in their lives. They would know it like it's their next door neighbor. This wasn't a surprise or an odd story. It was the reality in which the world in which they lived. The elite, the powerful, enjoying power and food and a banquet and celebration right next to people who suffer and hurt and who have nothing. It's an unavoidable image, not only for that time, but I think for many centuries following, that we can recognize this reality in the world around us. The arbitrariness, the challenge of a world in which those who are powerful can hurt the weak. And to be truthful, that image really struck me this week. And I had a question. I had to struggle with this a little bit this week. I asked myself, I go to a lectionary group, I asked them, I says, where is the grace in this story? If we really take seriously the image Mark is portraying for us of the inequality, iniquity, the painfulness of that separation, and how the powerless have nothing and the rich and famous have everything. Where is the good news in that story? And I'll be honest, I struggled to find it. And this week, on the recommendation of a number of you, I happened to go see, and it wasn't a place I expected maybe to find some good news, but it was a documentary that's out called Who Will Be My Neighbor? How many of y'all have seen that? Have seen it? Not many. It tells the story of Mr. Rogers, who was a Presbyterian minister who also in his ministry was evangelism through television. And he's a rather odd kind of guy. As you watch this documentary, he's kind of so laser focused on ministry to children. And he had Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, which was this really kind of low-key, low-production. There were puppets, but they were always geared to show lessons. He didn't, he said, want to condescend to children. He wanted to tell them the truth and share the reality and share this sense in which kids should be honored and not played down to. And he says he had one central message he wanted to communicate to all the children. It was just one central idea, no matter whatever the show was about, one central idea. And that idea was that if you really want to make a difference in the world, he says, you need to tell people they are loved and they are capable of love. And that's all he wanted to do in this television show, was to tell the kids they are loved and they are capable of love. And he says, that may sound Pollyannish in this world today, But that's the most important thing we can do for each other, is tell each other you are beloved and you have the capacity to love another human being. And what was interesting, which I didn't know this about Mr. Rogers' neighborhood, is they would deal with difficult questions. He never shied away from some of the challenging images. He talked about the Vietnam War with kids who were 5 years old. He talked about divorce with these kids, all centered on this idea of grace. You are beloved and you have the capacity to love another. In fact, one of the famous shows was following, this was set in the late 60s, following a time in which in the South they were forbidding black kids from swimming in white pools. And on his show, he had a little wading pool, and he had, in fact, it was kind of radical for the time, one of the regulars on the show was an African-American man who was a police officer. And in the show, he invites him to come. He has his shoes off his feet in this wading pool, washing off his feet, and he invites the African-American man to come forward, take his shoes off, and place his feet in the pool. Now, that doesn't sound too radical. In a world filled with images of King Herod, of injustice and iniquity, and here's this Mr. Rogers who preaches to little children about this truth, that you are loved and you are capable of love. But what struck me, what I kind of came away with, is this truth. Grace always overcomes. That in this world, where there are lots of King Herods, lots of evil and injustice, the truth is that we hold on to is grace will overcome that. Think about that. That in fact, what's interesting about this story is that Herod, who has killed John the Baptizer, is worried that he's come back. Because the truth is, when it comes right down to it, you can't behead grace. It looks like King Herod wins, but in the end, it's untrue. Grace always overcomes. Craig Ellison's African-American pastor, teaches pastoral care, Vanderbilt University, and he tells the story that when he was 8 years old, he was always a kid who was passionate about justice, about trying to create a better world. It was always a part of him, and the truth is, that's probably true of all our children. Very passionate about fairness, equity in the world, and are really startled by it. And he happened to be walking, he tells the story of walking with his Aunt Dory and asking her, what can I do to change the world? What can I really do to change the world? And Aunt Dory responded to him, not dismissing his question, but she says, baby, honey, I don't know that I can change the world, but I know I can change 3 feet around. So Craig Ellison, who engages in very intense dialogues and creates, he talks about changing the 3 feet around us. And the truth is, we know grace overcomes Because we're challenged to live out that grace 3 feet around us. To speak words of love and forgiveness and tolerance. To speak words of grace in a world filled with incivility and anger. And that's the call. As powerful as it seems King Herod is in the world, the arc of history always moves towards grace. And the challenge is, will we embrace that grace? Will we be given the task of telling people you are loved and you are capable of loving? To God be the glory this day and forevermore. Amen.